Welcome back to our study of the book of Daniel. My name is Kathy Brasby, and I will be leading us into a look at Daniel chapter 4. Let me tell you that this is one odd story. In spite of it being kind of an unusual story, I think we can find some application even for our days today. So let's give it a try. Okay, we will start with Daniel 4, 1 through 3. King Nebuchadnezzar sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. I want you all to know about the miraculous signs and wonders the Most High God has performed for me. How great are His signs, how powerful His wonders. His kingdom will last forever, His rule through all generations. Interesting start to our chapter when we see Nebuchadnezzar addressing all of his citizens and announcing to them the Most High God. If you remember, in earlier lessons, we have talked about how the Babylonians were very religious. They had many gods. And here now we have Nebuchadnezzar not just including God among the many gods, but now he is talking about the Most High God and singing praises to this one God. So we have to wonder, what has happened to bring about this event in Nebuchadnezzar's life? We have talked before about how vast a nation Babylon was at that time. It included many regions, many languages, many different people groups. And so here as Nebuchadnezzar addresses his people, he is including almost the known world in his address to them. Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that God has stepped into his life and done something extraordinary for him. When he talks about signs and wonders, it reminds us of the time of the Exodus. Go back in your Jewish history, back to the time when the Israelites were living in Egypt, and then God used Moses to take them out of Egypt, and he used different signs, different wonders. We talk about the plagues, but they were amazing events that happened that freed the people of Israel from the slavery of Pharaoh and allowed them to head toward the Promised Land. The Jews in exile who would be hearing this proclamation or later reading the book of Daniel would find great comfort to know that God was still performing miracles as He had in the time of the Exodus. Many of them would be in exile and wondering, has God forgotten us? Is God still here? We are a long ways from our homeland. Does God know about us here? And what about these great kings? They were reminded that God was more powerful than Pharaoh. Now they were reminded that God is even more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar in this great empire of Babylon. God protects His people in spite of the odds. The purpose of this story is to encourage those Jews living in exile under a huge empire. In spite of their helplessness before this seemingly all-powerful ruler, God had not forgotten them. This is the story of two sovereigns. We will see that a human king is totally dependent on divine will. He doesn't know it at first, but he is. We get at the very beginning of this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges God's power and authority. So let's continue with the story. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living in my palace in comfort and prosperity. The story takes place at the peak of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He's content, prosperous, apparently ideal existence, both he and his citizens. So the story takes place at the peak of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The whole nation is enjoying a time of comfort, prosperity, peace, and apparently an ideal existence. So let's go on. Daniel 4, starting at verse 5. But one night I had a dream that frightened me. I saw visions that terrified me as I lay in my bed. So I issued an order calling in all the wise men of Babylon so they could tell me what my dream meant. When all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers came in, I told them the dream, but they could not tell me what it meant. At last Daniel came in before him, and I told him the dream. He was named Belteshazzar after my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. We looked at a dream of Nebuchadnezzar in a previous chapter, if you remember. That particular time, he expected his advisors not only to interpret the dream, but also to tell him the dream, but not this time. He is probably older and wiser, and maybe he trusts his advisors more. It's hard to say. But when they can't tell him what the dream meant, he immediately calls for Daniel and has confidence that Daniel will be able to help him. And you notice he talks about Daniel having the spirit of the gods. That's his interpretation, certainly not Daniel's. The first dream came to him when he was a younger king, and it foretold the destruction of future empires. However, that dream assured him that Nebuchadnezzar would not be destroyed. So at that point, Nebuchadnezzar was on his way to the top of the world. Now, as we have the second dream, he would think of himself as being on top of the world. But this one is also a dream of the future. And it has a different purpose than the earlier dream. This dream's purpose is to turn him away from his proud ways. In both dreams, experts, those advisors, remember the astrologers and enchanters and magicians, etc., those experts could not tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream meant, but Daniel could in both cases. And in both cases, it foretold something that was coming in the future. So let's continue on, chapter 4, verse 9. I said to him, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too great for you to solve. Now, tell me what my dream means. Again, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that Daniel has a link to, we would say, to God. Nebuchadnezzar saw it as the gods. But he recognized a spiritual link that Daniel had. So let's go on. While I was lying in my bed, this is what I dreamed. I saw a large tree in the middle of the earth. The tree grew very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. This tree is very intriguing. If we go back to the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel used a picture of a towering tree to illustrate great royal splendor. And that splendor led to great pride and great destruction. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the tree symbolizes this link between heaven and earth, a connection. This tree provides shelter and sustenance, and it really represents the king, and part of his responsibility as a ruler was to provide for his people. Provide protection for them, sustenance, provision. That's part of his responsibility as a king. So, we need to see the tree as a life-giving resource. And we will see shortly, this tree represents Nebuchadnezzar. It is a huge tree, and Nebuchadnezzar probably linked that to his own greatness. Now, Daniel, when he references the tree in his interpretation, does not talk about the size of the tree, but Nebuchadnezzar references that. A tree touching the sky is a common biblical image, metaphor for pride. I want you to think about the tower builders in Babel in Genesis 11, where they gathered together and they said, we are such great and mighty people, and then we will build a tower that reaches the heavens. And God confused their language and scattered them. So that idea of a tower and a tree, both, are images of earth trying to reach heaven. And it is definitely an image of human pride. So we can see some pretty strong parallels with what's going on here in this dream of Nebuchadnezzar. So let's continue on, read further. Daniel 4:13. Then as I lay there dreaming, I saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. The messenger shouted, "Cut down the tree and lop off its branches, shake off its leaves and scatter its fruit, chase the wild animals from its shade and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze and surrounded by tender grass. Now let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the wild animals among the plants of the field. For 7 periods of time let him have the mind of a wild animal instead of the mind of a human." Have you noticed that the image has changed? We started out talking about a tree, how this tree provided protection, provision, comfort, and now as we go through those verses I read, the messenger starts out talking about the tree, but then it changes. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals. Let him have the mind of a wild animal. So we can see that the imagery changes from a tree to a person. And I think we can make that connection. So this angel or this messenger appears with orders to cut down the tree. And once that happens, the birds scatter, the animals scatter, because their paradise in this tree, so to speak, disappears. We get the idea of heaven here as well. It's repeated in verse 13, at the end of verse 15 as well. This tree reaches to heaven and is judged by heaven. God looks at this tree. It's coming up like it's becoming part of God's domain. The dew of heaven covers him, whoever this him is. We will learn shortly it's Nebuchadnezzar. But the dew of heaven covers him, and the dew provides for his needs by watering plants that he eats. So we see, even though the tree is cut down, heaven continues to provide for him, this man in the dream. And in the end, we get the idea that as heaven is providing for him, it is not him who is self-sufficient, but he is provided for by God. The image changes as Nebuchadnezzar describes the dream. We have this tree stump, and then we have the human mind, and then we have this human mind changed to an animal mind. And the reason for that is so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign. In other words, the human mind is reduced to animal mind to teach that humans are not supreme. So let's continue verse 17, which is actually the message of the chapter. So verse 17 says, "For this has been decreed by the messengers. It is commanded by the holy ones, so that everyone may know that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world. He gives them to anyone he chooses, even to the lowliest of people." So we see that the Most High rules over the kingdoms, and kings may appear invincible, but they are not. Even Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the massive Babylonian empire, this empire that he believes he has brought to a place of peace and comfort and prosperity, appearances can be deceiving. He thought he was ultimate and supreme. But instead, in the dream, he is told he will become the lowliest. He will become like an animal. So let's continue on with our story. Daniel 4:19. Upon hearing this, Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, was overcome for a time, frightened by the meaning of the dream. Then the king said to him, "Belteshazzar, don't be alarmed by the dream and what it means. Belteshazzar replied, I wish the events foreshadowed in this dream would happen to your enemies, my lord, and not to you. Now, Daniel understood the dream immediately, and he was concerned about its significance. We see here that he had respect for this great king, saying, I wish it would happen to somebody, your enemies, rather than to you. He was very horrified at what was about to befall Nebuchadnezzar, and he was not vindictive. We might be tempted to get revenge on this great king who has stolen me away from my homeland, who's brought me to this strange place, taken away virtually everything I had. Daniel is not vindictive. And really, one of the threads that runs through this chapter is, can we be like Daniel? Can we care for powerful rulers, even when we don't agree with everything they do? Let's just take a little side note for a minute and contrast this dream with Jesus in Philippians 2. Jesus is God. Jesus came to earth as a human. Jesus is also the picture of humility. Let's take a look real quickly at Philippians 2 to see something about the humility of Jesus. Though he was God, he did not think equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. There is our picture of humility. And it's a challenging one. I think we can see in Daniel someone who was a humble servant, who was not vindictive, who was serving his king to the best of his ability and serving God totally. So let's continue on. Daniel now begins to explain the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. So let's look at Daniel 4:20 and 21. The tree you saw was growing very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves and was loaded with fruit for all to eat. Wild animals lived in its shade, and the birds nested in its branches. Notice the imagery. This is a very lush and green picture, a picture of a beautiful garden or a forest with plenty and shade for the birds, a protection from the hot sun. And it's just a very lush picture that we see. We will continue in Daniel 4:22. That tree, your majesty, is you. For you have grown strong and great. Your greatness reaches up to the heaven, and your rule to the ends of the earth. So we see in chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar is now a powerful, flourishing king of a prosperous empire. So that what we see here is a fulfillment of the dream that he had earlier, when he was told that he would become a great king. He is a great king. He has an incredible empire. Very lush, very prosperous, very comfortable, very secure. So let's go on. Daniel 4:23. Then you saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze, and surrounded by tender grass. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals of the field for 7 periods of time. Odd turn of events here. The great tree is cut down. The bands of bronze and iron kind of remind us of that first dream, the statue, remember, of the different layers of different metals. And we see, as we talked earlier, about how the image changes from a tree to a man. And this man is cast out. He's drenched with dew. He's living in the forest. He is living like an animal. So let's continue with Daniel 4:24. This is what the dream means, your majesty, and what the Most High has declared will happen to my lord the king. You will be driven from human society, and you will live in the fields with the wild animals. You will eat grass like a cow, and you will be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. But the stump and roots of the tree were left in the ground. This means you will receive your kingdom back again when you have learned that heaven rules. The purpose of the second dream is to indict Nebuchadnezzar for failing to listen to the message of the first dream. That dream told him to God alone belongs wisdom and power and authority and glory. God gives those to humans and he takes them away at his choosing. Nebuchadnezzar's refusal to acknowledge God as a supreme king is his downfall. So we are told Nebuchadnezzar will be ousted from civilization. It's a crazy image, isn't it? We don't know what happened. I mean, there might have been a royal coup and he was kicked out. It might have been insanity that caused his advisors to send him away, or perhaps he ran away in an insane state. But we know that he was exiled from human society for a time. The greatest king of the day was transformed into a beast for thinking himself to be a god. Think about that. He thought he was at the highest level, and he is now transformed into a beast. It does carry some shadows of that Tower of Babel story, where people thought they could exalt themselves by building a tower, and instead they are scattered and confused. So let's continue with verse 27. King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. Stop sinning and do what is right. Break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. Daniel is not vindictive. We see it again. He offers advice instead. Please take care of the poor. Please do what's right. Break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Isn't it interesting that the one specific we get is to be merciful to the poor? That may well be a hint to us that Nebuchadnezzar was ignoring the lowliest. We're also reminded that this tree was very abundant with plenty and should have been able to care for even the very poor. So it suggests to us that Nebuchadnezzar was not sharing that abundance with the poor. Let's continue with our story. In Daniel 4:28, but all these things did happen to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, he was taking a walk on the flat roof of the royal palace in Babylon. As he looked out across the city, he said, "Look at this great city of Babylon. By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor." It took 12 months before this happened to him, after Daniel had interpreted the dream. Was God merciful and gave him time to make some changes? Did Nebuchadnezzar take Daniel's counsel for a while? We don't know for sure. After 12 months, we see Nebuchadnezzar out strutting on the roof of his palace, admiring his amazing city and taking full credit for it. What we see is Nebuchadnezzar congratulating himself and claiming this power, authority, dominion, and glory for himself. He claimed he had built Babylon by his own power and for his own glory. Do you see that Tower of Babel thing going on? We could become like the gods. God had given Nebuchadnezzar many gifts, and now they became a source of pride and self-importance. Babylon contained 2 of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens and the city walls. The location of the Hanging Gardens is in doubt, but the walls have been traced. The outer walls stretched for more than 8 kilometers and, according to Herodotus, had enough space on top to enable a 4-horse chariot to turn around. It was a pretty awesome city. We see Nebuchadnezzar congratulating himself for this awesome city. Let's continue our story. Daniel 4:31. while these words were still in his mouth. And if you recall, those words were, "By my own mighty power, I have built this beautiful city as my royal residence to display my majestic splendor." And while those words were still in his mouth, a voice called down from heaven, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, this message is for you. You are no longer ruler of this kingdom. You will be driven from human society. You will live in the fields with the wild animals, and you will eat grass like a cow. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses." The dream came true. Nebuchadnezzar is helpless before God. He is no longer ruler of this kingdom. Daniel 4:33. That same hour the judgment was fulfilled, and Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society. He ate grass like a cow, and he was drenched with the dew of heaven. He lived this way until his hair was as long as an eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. So we see the insanity here of Nebuchadnezzar. He was more like an animal than a man. He loses his humanity, his dignity. He's out living among the animals. He is lower than the lowliest of humans. But let's continue. Daniel 4:34. After this time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned, and I praised and worshiped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. At this point, we see finally Nebuchadnezzar comes to himself, and he realizes his own pride has caused him this terrible dilemma. And he praises and worships the Most High God. So let's continue to hear what he has to say about God. His rule is everlasting, and his kingdom is eternal. Quite a contrast between Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, God's kingdom. All the people of the earth are nothing compared to him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, "What do you mean by doing these things?" Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. He acknowledges God. He praises, he exalts, he recognizes the glory of God. He acknowledges the power and authority of God. So verse 36, when my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of my kingdom with even great honor than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud. It's absolutely amazing that Nebuchadnezzar, one of the greatest kings of the ancient times, was helpless before the God of Israel. This portrayal of their captor as being humbled by God had to be an encouragement to the Jews in exile. This story took place during that exile. And as I've said before, the Jews in Babylon had to question whether God had any power because they had been taken away. He didn't seem to have ever protected them. A story like this reminds them that the God in heaven, the Most High God, was still able to overcome any ruler that he chose to overcome. Now we might wonder why on earth God chose this method to humble Nebuchadnezzar. So what can we learn from this story? Again, I refer you back to the Tower of Babel, about people who decided to build a tower to reveal their own power and greatness, and instead found out they are not gods. God is able to scatter and confuse where he wish. A tree or a tower reaching to heaven can remind us that as humans, sometimes we can get too big for our britches, so to speak. We forget who we serve. And we may set ourselves up for God to remind us of our place. We are not gods. The lesson of Daniel 4 is simple. God is supreme in heaven, and mortals don't reach that. The tree provides many benefits, as a king should do. to protect and provide. But when he failed to do that in a just way, God intervened. In our modern world, we can assume that our current systems are sufficient. We have finally become sophisticated enough that we can achieve all that we want to achieve. And then we tend to push God back. It's okay, God, I've got this. We are partnering with him. We work with him. But that's a key. We work with him. We work as we're called, and we allow him to direct us. We don't trust our own resources above what he gifts to us. Another point that I want to make is that Nebuchadnezzar lost his mind for a time. And then his mind is renewed. And at that point, he worships God. He acknowledges God as sovereign. And I want us to notice about that mind thing. If we go to Romans 12:2, it reminds us, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by the renewing of your mind. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. And we want to remember, God is not far away. He is not detached. And we want to remember, do we want to raise up ourselves as a ruler of our world, even if it's just our own little private world? Do we see ourselves as sovereign? Or do we want to praise the God of heaven? When you get to the very essence of Daniel 4, with his odd dream and his odd story, when you get to the very essence of it, it is a good antidote for human pride. Thanks for joining me as we go through Daniel 4. Next time, we're going to look at another odd story that has a lot to say about God's working in Babylon as we look at Daniel 5. So I hope you have a great week. Thanks for coming. God bless.